course, and the logical place to start is by asking the question, what is democracy? And to do this, I've found it necessary to make a distinction between two levels of democracy. One is the kind of minimum condition for a country being called a democracy at all. And this is what I call, and what many people in the field call, electoral democracy. And then there's a higher threshold of democracy, which I call liberal democracy. We shouldn't think of liberal in the context of the economic system or neoliberal economics or something. I think here we can largely separate economic system, economic structure from political system. And it's liberal in a sense that I'm going to introduce to you in a moment about the extent of protection for rights and the rule of law, and in some ways qualifying the purely popular element of democracy. If democracy is taken as a start from the Greek word, the people rule of the people, then the question is that all, and is that an absolute good? And of course, the framers of the American Constitution worried, I think from my own personal standpoint, excessively, but worried about the potential for rule of the people to become a tyranny of its own if it was unchecked, to become a tyranny of a temporary majority of the people. And of course, that is extremely relevant to the current debate about illiberal populism. So we have two levels of democracy, a minimum threshold of electoral democracy, a higher threshold of liberal democracy. We'll think in the next lecture about how we can measure and recognize these, but bear these in mind now. And then the next issue is, what about regimes that look like democracies but don't meet the minimum definition, but otherwise they have the superficial form? And those I used to call pseudo-democracies, fake democracies, or semi-democracies. We've had in the last 10 or 15 years, and that actually is an article on the syllabus for this week, that is one of the ones that I strongly recommend you get started reading by the end of this week. It's by Steve Levitsky and Lucan Way, and they call this kind of semi or pseudo-democracy competitive authoritarianism. You've got competition, but it doesn't amount to or meet the minimal conditions of electoral democracy. And then, of course, you can scale down from that to authoritarian regimes that aren't even really competitive. They may have elections, but there aren't even any competitive elements to the elections. And then you've got countries like China and North Korea that don't even have the facade of multi-party elections. Okay? So let's start with electoral democracy. We can, of course, apply this to many levels of political authority, but in this course we're mainly thinking about democracy as a phenomenon at the level of the modern nation state. And we're asking how countries can achieve and maintain democratic forms of government. And in its simplest form, a democracy is a means, and there are a variety of institutional mechanisms for achieving this, as I've already explained, and that constitute part of the meat of the course. It's a means for people to choose their leaders, and if they wish to do so, to replace their leaders or their collections of leaders, which we generally call political parties, in regular, meaningful, free, and fair elections. Okay? Now, that sounds, and of course, then there's this additional proviso. Regular, meaningful, free, and fair sounds like a pretty minimalist condition. It's just choose and replace leaders. That doesn't seem to amount to much. If you then add this on, that you take freedom seriously, and it's not just kind of freedom to vote and freedom of different political parties to register and contest, but there's some kind of minimal surrounding environment for freedom so that competing parties can be heard and to get their message out in a minimal way. Once you start thinking about this, as I'll explain in a moment, it's not so trivial anymore. And it raises really interesting and really contemporary, agonizing issues that have generated diverse views about how to classify countries. And the most, I find the Rorschach test is to ask this question: is Hungary today, in January of 2019, does it meet this test of electoral democracy? I have my own answer to this question, but it's not the same answer as the European Union today, and certainly not the same answer as the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban. Okay, so let's see what these other elements are. First of all, regular. Okay, well, that's pretty straightforward. That means that the elections have to take place at some kind of constitutionally prescribed interval. Now, is there anyone here who doesn't understand the difference between a parliamentary and a presidential system? Presidential systems, regular is very straightforward. There's a presidential term. It begins on a certain date and it ends on a certain date, and then there are new elections. In a parliamentary system, a government can fall and new elections can be held earlier than the full term of parliament, but regular stipulates that the term of parliament can't be longer than a certain date. And by the end of that date, elections have to happen. Of course, in some countries, there are separate dates for the election of parliament and for president because it's a semi-presidential system. So once you start getting elections delayed or suspended, already, even if everything else is in place, an essential minimal condition for electoral democracy has been violated. Okay, now meaningful. This is the certainly one of the elements of the definition of democracy that can be most elusive and confusing and can create a pretext for a regime that is not a democracy to claim it as a democracy if this isn't taken seriously. Because take a country like Morocco. Anybody know anything about Morocco? About what type of political system it has? So how is its government chosen?
They have a king that's above the law.
Okay, well, but does it have a parliament?
I think so.
Huh?
I think it does.
It does, yeah. And how's the parliament chosen? Anyone know? Through multi-party elections at regular intervals. Are the multi-party elections free and fair? I'm told reasonably so. Is there a perfect climate of freedom around it? No. I mean, if you take away the monarchy and leave everything else exactly as it is, there'd probably still be problems and debates about whether we could call Morocco a democracy. But in the purely electoral aspect, elections in Morocco may be more democratic than certainly many countries that claim to be democracies now. The problem is that the parliament that is elected and the prime minister that emerges out of the parliament does not really run the majority of consequential affairs of the country. The key decisions on security, potentially even on the economy, on the distribution of wealth in the country and so on, are made from above, not only by the monarch, who I will say is a, to put it politely, fairly detached figure right now, often out of the country, but by a vast kind of undemocratic, non-accountable state and royalist establishment around the king himself. So obviously, if you have, even competitive elections, and there's a lot of uncertainty, and the votes are counted fairly, and the other conditions I'm laying out are more or less met, but there's some power sitting above that's the real hidden authority in the country, then you can't call that system a democracy. Now, can you think of any other countries that would fall into this category?
To your point there, you have Iran. That's the opposite.
Iran.
With the Ayatollah, but a number of others are, I think.
Okay, so in Iran you have at least somewhat competitive elections, although you don't really have multiple parties and you have the Guardian Council vetting the candidates, but you've got some degree of competition in elections, and even if there were much more extensive and unfiltered competition for power in Iran, it still wouldn't be a democracy, because who is the ultimate decision maker in Iran? Anybody know? The supreme leader, of course, Ayatollah Khamenei, who is accountable to only one figure, and it's not the people. Any other examples?
I don't know if this is true in practice, but would the House of Lords kind of qualify?
The House of Lords would qualify if the House of Lords had substantial power. But it's been a long time since the House of Lords had real power in Britain. It can delay legislation, but it can't really block it. Yeah?
Would you consider Russia?
Would I consider Russia well, no, I wouldn't consider Russia to fail to be a democracy on these grounds. I consider Russia to be very, very far from being a democracy. But the reason why is that elections are very far from being free and fair. But the person who has the real power is the person who is, in theory, democratically elected. That is Vladimir Putin. So, of course, there is a huge security establishment around the power structure that is not democratically accountable. But it is to Putin, and he is, claims to be democratically elected, even though he's not democratically elected.
You put up there the examples of monarchy and the military. What would be kind of like an oligarchic, non-monarchy or military example? Because those are the only kinds of states I can think of off the top of my head.
An oligarchic kind of ruling.
Yeah, that's not the military or monarch.
Did you want to answer his
another
question?
example, yeah, like I guess Hong Kong, because like you could say like China is the higher authority.
Okay, so certainly you have Hong Kong as an example of a country, well, not a country, that's a big mistake, a political system within a larger political system that is not a democracy because it is subject to the control and veto of a non-democratically accountable authority, which is the Beijing authorities. And increasingly, elections in Hong Kong are not even democratic within themselves, in the sense that the Hong Kong authorities, in response to Beijing pressure, have been disqualifying a lot of democratically elected candidates. The other country that I would nominate here under the military category, just as an example, is Pakistan, where you have very competitive elections, but the military just, it really has ultimate veto authority and domineering power over politics and society. Anything else before we move on? Yeah?
Myanmar with military control of the military control of the parliament.
Okay. So Myanmar is a very interesting illustration here because you have, in some ways, quite democratic elections, which the National League for Democracy, again, as it had 25 years before, won overwhelmingly in 2015. But the Constitution is rigged. There, it's not even hidden. It's right on the surface that the military has a quarter of the seats in Parliament and, has rigged the constitutional system so it has ultimate power. Yeah?
Maybe Lebanon would be an example with the influence of Hezbollah.
Right. I think it is because Hezbollah really, even though it kind of enters the political process, has veto authority and, in fact, behind Hezbollah, of course, is Iran. Okay, yeah?
If a country has a supreme authority like a king, but they have no real power, is this?
Well, then you're talking about the constitutional monarchies of Britain, Sweden, Denmark, and a number of other countries. So if you have a constitutional monarchy, having a figurehead at the top that's merely ceremonial or symbolic doesn't violate this principle.